aerial bombardments of specific targets inside Damascus itself, the capital of Syria. There was very real concern that this could escalate into a full-scale war. The Israelis, we have decided to show a degree of flexibility in terms of where we will be deployed inside the Gaza Strip, but that flexibility pertains to the 60 days. It does not pertain to a permanent status agreement. To have a Hamas stronghold reconstitute itself in Beit Hanoun is completely unacceptable. In a post-October 7th era, I believe that most Israelis will not accept anything short of the enlistment of the ultra-Orthodox community into military service within the Israel Defense Forces. Now, today, we seem to be in a situation where a very tense standoff and even engagement between Israel, the Israeli Druze, the Syrian Druze, and militias inside Syria that reported to the Syrian regime of al-Julani actually seem to be headed towards an open and spreading and widening conflict. And it surrounded events that took place in Suwayda. There was a massacre at the Suwayda hospital undertaken by these forces that reported to al-Julani, even though he denied as much. And those massacres resulted in horrific scenes that are so barbaric and brutal, the deaths and murders of patients from inside that hospital, that they've actually not been broadcast. And those attacks went on and continued against the Druze population inside southern Syria. Now, the Druze population inside southern Syria very often has family connections to the Druze population inside northern Israel, a population here in Israel that is deeply loyal and committed to the government of the State of Israel and to the law of the land of the State of Israel. But that complication, that reality that the Israeli Druze are related and connected to the Syrian Druze brought about a situation where when the Israeli Druze saw their Syrian Druze brethren being massacred and also being humiliated, there are pictures and videos that have been circulated of Druze holy men and spiritual leaders having their mustaches shaved by these Syrian militias, which is an act and a gesture of complete humiliation intended as such. When the Israeli Druze saw those actions being undertaken against their Syrian brethren, they started to move towards the fence between northern Israel and southern Syria. And in fact, dozens of Israeli Druze moved across the border into southern Syria and actually arrived at the southern Syrian town of Suwayda. And Syrian Druze moved in the opposite direction from Syria into Israel. But there was a very real concern in Israel that the group moving into our territory was not limited to the Syrian Druze, but actually could have included the infiltration of terrorists seeking to do harm here in Israel. And all of this is occurring in the aftermath, of course, of October the 7th. So Israel responded by not only demanding of the Israeli Druze that they stop and they cease and desist moving from northern Israel into southern Syria, but also by implementing security guarantees that it has actually promised to its Israeli Druze community to protect the Druze community inside southern Syria. And that manifested in several ways, including aerial attacks on APCs that were under the charge of the Syrian regime that were heading toward Suwayda. Also aerial attacks by the Israeli Air Force on tanks that were headed toward Suwayda, and indeed detonations and aerial bombardments of specific targets inside Damascus itself, the capital of Syria. Against all of that, there was very real concern that this could escalate into a full-scale war. Now, that has been averted. It has been averted in no small part as a consequence of American pressure to de-escalate. Things today are calmer. They have de-escalated to some degree, but Prime Minister Netanyahu, having managed to bring about an end to the Israeli Druze moving into Syria and the Syrian Druze moving into Israel, has actually had to proceed and declare all Syrian territory south of Damascus as a demilitarized zone. Syrian forces are not permitted to operate in that area under Israeli enforcement, and people here are hopeful that there will not be a requirement for any deployment of Israeli defense forces into southern Syria, given that we are fighting on so many fronts still to this day. The status of negotiations for a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas inside the Gaza Strip, and that ceasefire being brokered in pursuit of the return of our hostages from Hamas captivity, they having been seized during the massacre of October the 7th, those negotiations are ongoing, and Hamas is continuing to cling to its maximalist demands as part of its negotiating strategy, which include the complete withdrawal of the Israel Defense Forces from all territories that it currently holds inside the Gaza Strip, and also a demand that the United Nations will again be charged with the distribution of humanitarian aid throughout the Gaza Strip, something that Hamas knows is a mechanism that it can readily hijack, readily take advantage of, and by way of taking advantage of the distribution of humanitarian aid, can actually start to regain its footing as the leading regime inside the Gaza Strip. Now, with regard to Hamas's demands, the Israelis, we have decided to show a degree of flexibility in terms of where we will be deployed inside the Gaza Strip, but that flexibility pertains to the 60 days mooted period of time during which there will be a ceasefire between the IDF and Hamas. It does not pertain to a permanent status agreement. And it's very important that people recognize and understand that. Now, in my opinion, in order to ensure long-term security for the citizens of southern Israel, and indeed for Israelis writ large, the Israeli government has to stand by two particular principles. Firstly, as far as the deployment of our forces is concerned, we must hold the perimeter surrounding the Gaza Strip. That's a territory that variously ranges from about 1.5 kilometers into Gazan territory to about 2.5 kilometers inside Gazan territory. And that area must be manned by the Israeli Defense Forces in order to prevent another October 7th attack ever taking place. And it absolutely includes a permanent presence of the Israel Defense Forces along the Philadelphi Corridor that divides southern Gaza from the Sinai Peninsula, which is sovereign Egyptian territory. And I remind everybody that it's from the area adjacent to the Philadelphi Corridor that Hamas terrorists were smuggling themselves out of Gaza into the Sinai Peninsula, traveling up to Lebanon, moving into Syria, going across Iraq, into Iran, receiving military training, weapons, and know-how, and then reversing that route back through the Sinai Peninsula into Gaza, precisely to launch attacks, the like of which we all bore witness to on October the 7th. So that border between southern Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt not only must be sealed, but it must be manned in perpetuity by the Israel Defense Forces. Now, prior to October the 7th, and indeed today, it was manned by Egyptian forces. I believe that Egypt, as a result of the porous nature of that border, bears massive culpability and responsibility for what took place on October the 7th. So in terms of the first principle that I mentioned, the IDF must retain its presence throughout the perimeter of the Gaza Strip, particularly because it's deemed a controversial subject, though I don't think it is one, along the Philadelphi Corridor. In addition to that, the second principle, in my view, is that the government of the State of Israel should move with all deliberate purpose, dedication, and focus towards the implementation and realization of the Trump vision for Gaza, namely the volunteer immigration and relocation of Gazans from inside the Gaza Strip to countries that are willing to absorb the Gazans. First and foremost, incidentally, I think that the Americans should be moving to induce a readiness among the Egyptians to absorb the Gazan Palestinian Arabs into their midst. The reason that I believe that's so important is that it's from among the Gazan population that Hamas is replenishing its forces. It's the Gazan population that cheered as our kidnapped elderly women were paraded through the streets of Gaza on October the 7th. It's the Gazan population that cheered as our dead soldiers were trailed throughout the Gaza Strip in the aftermath of October the 7th. And it's the Gazan population who have expressed ongoing support for the acts and the principles of Hamas. And I think that as long as that population is proximate to the borders of the state of Israel, the people of Israel will not know safety or long-term security. It's in accordance with that principle that I believe it's appropriate to move the Gazan population to southern Gaza to a dedicated area between the city of Rafah and the city of Khan Yunis, with a view to that being a platform from which they are able to freely emigrate to the countries ready to absorb them. Those principles need to be stood by. I hope that they will be. And most importantly, Israel must continue, as we are doing, to make all possible efforts to bring our hostages home from captivity inside the Gaza Strip. Current negotiations refer to 10 hostages being released, living hostages being released over the 60-day period, if that agreement is struck. But of course, all efforts must continue until all of our hostages are returned, those who are living and those who are no longer alive. So the area of Beit Hanoun is being hit particularly hard and is being focused on by the Israel Defense Forces because it's from that area and within that area that, among other things, 3 of our soldiers were killed recently. 3 soldiers were killed by way of an ambush that was set up by Hamas terrorists who are now fighting as a guerrilla insurgency force. They're no longer a functioning terror army in the manner that they were prior to October 7th and Israel's counteroffensive against Hamas, but they are swiftly adapting themselves into a very dangerous guerrilla force, learning our tactics, learning our maneuvers, learning our strategies inside Gaza, and then using those against us. Now, Beit Hanoun is also approximately 3 kilometers from the Israeli city of Sderot. And to have a Hamas stronghold reconstitute itself in Beit Hanoun is completely unacceptable for that very reason. Now, the IDF has operated in that area before, but it has operated in that area in a manner where it went in and withdrew, went in and withdrew. And it now seems to be the case that there remains something of a tunnel infrastructure in those surrounding areas of Beit Hanoun. It needs to be cleared, that infrastructure needs to be destroyed, and most importantly, to have a rebuilding of terror capabilities in that area is completely unacceptable. It needs to be dismantled, and it's absolutely right and correct that the IDF is intensifying its focus in that area. So the debate over the ultra-Orthodox community and its role within broader Israeli society has really evolved since October the 7th. Prior to October the 7th, I believe that most Israelis would have accepted the ultra-Orthodox Israeli community moving toward enfranchisement within Israeli society. Now, that enfranchisement might include gainful employment. It might include paying taxes to the Israeli state. It might have included volunteering and undertaking some sort of national service, not necessarily military national service inside Israel, such as manning hospitals, driving ambulances, taking up the role of being an EMT on ambulances, caring for Holocaust survivors. The opportunities and the options were endless prior to October the 7th. But in a post-October 7th era, I believe that most Israelis will not accept anything short of the enlistment of the ultra-Orthodox community into military service within the Israel Defense Forces. Some years ago, the chief commander of the IDF said that the Israel Defense Forces must be converted into a tzava chacham v'katan, a wise and small military, a military that incidentally would be dependent upon its technological edge against its enemies. In the wake of October 7th, it's become eminently clear that the IDF must in fact be a large and smart and intelligent military, and it is in need of significant manpower. I want to give you some points to consider. To this point in the war against Hamas, 893 soldiers of the IDF have been killed in battle. In 2024, in an effort to draft the ultra-Orthodox community into service within the IDF, 24,000 summonses for service went out. Out of those 24,000 summonses to the ultra-Orthodox community, only 1,200 reported to the drafting office. And out of that 1,200 who reported to the drafting office, only 422 actually donned the uniform of the IDF and took up their role in the national effort to defend this country in the midst of a 7-front war. That situation is not acceptable. And what that actually means is that there are IDF reservists who have done more days of military service during the course of this war than the total number of ultra-Orthodox young men who have reported to the line and taken up their role in the defense of this country. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and make sure that you check out the MirYam Institute YouTube channel, where you'll find more analysis, podcasts, and incredible footage. If you want to see our very latest content, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so that you'll get notifications automatically. And remember that we really want to know what you think, and we want to hear the questions that you want answered. So please let us know about all of that in the comments section, and I'll see you next time.